The first is, if you're an entrepreneur, you're going to be a risk taker. And anytime you take risks, you're going to make mistakes. And just recognize that you're going to make mistakes, but you shouldn't make that same mistake again. You should learn from that. The other thing I would say is find good people to work with, right? I mean, usually if you're starting a company, unless if it's later in your life where you have more resources, you might not need other people necessarily to help you. But if you're starting early and you don't have a lot of money, a lot of resources, you need to find people that have skill sets you don't have.
As more and more EdTech tools flood the market, it's easy to forget the best ones don't come from Silicon Valley, they come from the classroom. In this episode of Education Matters, we continue our special series on EdTech by spotlighting someone who bridges the gap between the classroom and the startup world. Dr. Julian Reed is a longtime professor at Furman University, a public health researcher, and the founder of ActiveEd, the company behind the Walkabouts platform, a tool designed to integrate physical movement into core classroom subjects. Julian's story is both personal and powerful. A self-described hyperactive kid who struggled in school, he went on to build a career studying how physical activity improves cognition, memory, and academic performance. Along the way, he recognized that most classrooms weren't designed for how kids actually learn, especially for boys and especially for those that like to move. In our conversation, Julian shares the science behind movement and learning, how his research turned into professional development for teachers, and why he eventually launched an EdTech company to scale his practice. We talk about the founding story of Walkabouts, the challenges of selling into education, and the lessons he's learned about product market fit, fundraising, and impact. For any founder trying to build a tool that actually helps teachers and students, not just sell to them, Julian offers a grounded, humble, and inspiring blueprint. Here's my conversation with Dr. Julian Reed. Julian Reed, welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
It finds me in Greenville, South Carolina.
Wonderful. And for those viewing on the YouTube channel, you'll see your office here. Where is your office?
So I'm in the Department of Health Sciences at Furman University, and I cleaned up my office a little bit just for you, so you can imagine what it was before.
Well, it's the classic professor's office, which
That's right.
Which makes me feel right at home.
Right.
So with that, Julian, can you give the audience a sense of your current role, and then we'll jump into your background?
Sure. So I've been at Furman. This will be my 23rd year. I'm in the Department of Health Sciences. My area of research is really twofold. What we're going to focus on today is really how I examine how physical activity and fitness impacts academic achievement and cognition of kids. So that's where I've been spending most of my time. And I also, which we will get into, founded an EdTech company called ActiveEd, and our platform is called Walkabouts, and it allows teachers to teach math, language arts, social studies, and science with physical activity.
So I definitely want to dive in particular, given that this is one of the special episodes for other EdTech entrepreneurs out there, dive into that background. But can we start with where and when you grew up?
Sure. So I'm originally from Malibu, California. I went from Malibu, California to upstate New York for college and actually boarding school. At the time in Malibu, there was no high school. And obviously most people think Malibu, a bunch of rich kids. Actually, when I lived in Malibu, it was a middle class. And the high school was in Santa Monica. There was no high school, and I was doing terribly in school. And my dad was in radio, and he had a great friend in the music business who basically provided an opportunity for me to go to this boarding school that needed a soccer goalie. And I happened to play soccer. I had a friend there a year ahead. And that really changed my life because I wasn't a student. I was a terrible student, which is ironic because my dad died when I was very young, and he was in although he was in radio, he was really getting his PhD in political science and was very academic. But when I was a little kid, all I cared about was playing sports. But I went to this boarding school, it whipped me in shape. And then I went to college in a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, and then did a master's degree in the University of Miami, and then did a doctorate at the University of Northern Colorado. And then when I was here working at Furman, I got really interested in public health, and I got a master's in public health from the University of South Carolina.
So if I can ask you, what started your academic journey? You said school, you didn't feel like school was for you, but how did you find your way all the way to a PhD and to that seat as a professor?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, school not being for me. I was always a mover and hyper. Now we would obviously label me with something, but back then it was just hyper. But I've always been someone who's been very active. And once I got to boarding school, I realized the importance of education. I didn't really appreciate it prior to then. And then when I went to my undergrad, I really thought I was going to be a physical therapist. So I was really interested in PT. But then my senior year, I volunteered at a geriatric division. And I probably shouldn't have done that because there's different divisions of PT. Because sports were really important to me. I played two sports in college, but that kind of turned me away from PT, and I got really interested in sports medicine. And so I thought I was going to be an athletic trainer or a director of a curriculum program in athletic training. And I went and got my master's in the University of Miami. And during that time, I also started getting really interested in just overall physical activity and looking at how sports impact health well beyond physical health. And that led me to Colorado, where professors there were studying the impacts of physical activity and cognition, and as well as just exercise science and kinesiology. And so I did that, and then you're looking for jobs, and I went to a small liberal arts college, and Furman is a small liberal arts college. So I thought, hey, this is something that I knew I wanted to teach and do research, and really kind of a balance versus going to a research one university where you're just doing research and getting grants. And so as I got to Furman, my wife's a classroom teacher, and as I was doing, research on physical activity of youth, I was always picking her brain on, hey, how do we get more movement in the classroom? Knowing that integration's been around for a long time. And I was studying this, of course, during my doctoral work, but she was now a classroom teacher, and I was, bouncing ideas off her. And I saw a real opportunity to help teachers. So I redesigned a course for all classroom teachers at the university that gets certification. So not in our department, education department. And it was really to train teachers on how to teach with movement. And it was really during this time, if you remember, the late 90s is really when childhood obesity terminology, mid 90s, started coming around. But it really focused our administrators and our health enthusiasts in the early 2000s, and was like, okay, how are we going to stymie this onset of childhood obesity? And one thing that many researchers have said well before me was, well, where do kids spend most of their time? They spend it at school. And we know they're not getting as much PE time because there's not enough money. How can we infuse more physical activity throughout the school day? And most administrators, to their credit, agreed with that. But at the same time, they were like, okay, but we only have so much time to do certain things. And so my brain really started going online and reading as much as I could about how to marry physical activity with, the standard curricula in math, language arts, social studies, and science. And so I actually then went on to start professional development throughout the country and helping teachers do this. But at the same time, I was also starting my own family. So it was hard traveling all the time. So I thought, okay, maybe I can write a book on this. And that would be kind of take place, me spending so much time away. And then I kept getting lots of questions throughout, not just South Carolina and North Carolina and neighboring states, but people got a hold of some of my work and were like, can you give me more ideas and what have you, beyond just paper to pencil type static lessons? That was typically what was out there at the time. And really, when we started this company, which I'll get to here in a second, Go Noodle was kind of coming around at the same time. So there were a lot of really smart people thinking about ways to do this, right? Well before my time. But as I was trying to come up with more ideas, you started to see a lot more technology come into classrooms, right? You started to see the pipes come in, if you will, for the Promethean boards, the projectors, and more technology that was not only supported by the federal government, but supported by state government, because they all wanted students to be technologically advanced because the world was changing, right? The internet was exploding, and they wanted to make sure children were equipped as they matriculate. So I looked at that as, okay, this is a great opportunity because there's only one of me. If I can take this idea and maybe turn it into a business, it can create a lot more scale. But ultimately, my goal always was how to help kids. It wasn't really to, hey, I'm going to start this business and try to make money. Because initially I tried to start it as a nonprofit, but I couldn't raise the money I needed to build the platform. And fortunately, during this time, I happened to just be at our neighborhood pool. You have kids, and I struck up conversation with another parent who had children the same age and talking about my book. And he was in marketing, but he was also an English, got an English degree, a master's degree, and had children with dysgraphia. So it really resonated with him. And so we continued to stay in conversation and in touch for the next few years. And then I realized I wanted to do this, but I needed help. So then I reached back out to him and I said, hey, I'm going to start this company. I need you to be a big part of it. You'll own quite a bit of it. You have a really interesting take on things. And would you be interested in pursuing this? And I was told by another entrepreneur as I was thinking about this, the best thing to do when you have no money is to find people with skill sets that you don't have and give them equity and kind of go from there. And that's really how it really started.
So I always love founding stories. I find it always inspiring how folks start and found companies and find ways to make it work. Before we jump fully into Walkabouts and the story there and what you're doing now, can you give folks a sense of your research? What was it that you were working on that really, made you realize like there is as concrete evidence as we can that this is good not only for obesity, but good for the brain and good for learning development?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that were happening simultaneously. As I was trying to get more movement into schools, right, I was starting to read the current literature out there from other health scientists and what have you, as how to leverage more activity. And as I said earlier, administrators are pretty supportive, but they're responsible for, academic performance. But if you're able to tell them, hey, we could actually improve the academic performance and improve behavior based on what the literature is saying, their ears started to perk up. And it became, okay, it's not just about that physical health. It's not just about fitness. It's about really helping kids focus, which is that executive function hypothesis, the blood going to those areas and bringing growth factors that stimulate neurons and dendrites and what have you. But it also improves academic achievement. And we knew anecdotally that it did that, but as the time was going to, for more and more researchers studying this, you now started to have real empirical evidence. And so it was a great book that came out in 2008 by John Rady called Spark. And he was the Harvard psychiatrist who was studying this. And not only among his patients, he went to a school in Illinois and saw how kids were performing better when they moved before their testing or they moved before class. Well, simultaneously as that was happening, there was a charter school opening up in Greenville that was working with under-resourced kids. I mean, 99% of these kids qualify for free or reduced lunch. And the founder of the school reached out to our department chair and said, hey, do you have somebody who can help me develop a PE program, but really with the focus on not just their physical health, but a way to get this movement to help them learn better. And so those two things just matched up really nicely. And so it was more evidence for me to say, hey, I think I have something here with potentially with this company, because you're hearing people outside of the discipline of, in higher ed saying, learning about movement and the health of kids and how movement in schools not only promotes their physical health, but also promotes their brain health. That really excited me. And so I started working and developing different studies. I did a study in a classroom, controls and experimental with just some simple integration. And we found at the end of the year, not only did their cognitive scores go up, but their academic achievement went up based on their state standards. And then I began working with other researchers throughout the country, and we were studying different populations with bigger sample sizes. At the same time, I realized, hey, there's an opportunity to help a lot of teachers who might only have a couple lessons in the back of their head to get kids moving as they learn. Because in elementary school, if you think back, and I can remember mine, you usually enjoyed moving around, and you actually had fun as you were learning. And that kinesthetic learning, that Dr. Montessori talked about, it's really as you get older in middle and high school where you don't want to be as active. So I was trying to figure out, hey, I think there's a way to leverage the physical activity. You get the administrators on board, and ultimately kids have fun. And so that's really how it all came together.
So is there actually something physiological that's happening? Our species was never sedentary, right?
I mean, we were never designed to sit. We're designed to move. So when you start moving, right, if most people just think of blood increasing throughout your body, which you need, right? When you're sitting I'm sitting right now, 80% of my blood is in my splenic region right here in the gut, and 20%, in your muscles and what have you. But then eventually, once you start moving, right, those muscles need energy and oxygen and a whole bunch of other things that we don't need to necessarily get into. But as that blood starts going to the brain, and this is when I was saying those growth factors, when you bring in these growth factors such as insulin growth factor, vasoendothelial growth factor, endothelial is right the lining of your blood vessels, that stimulates invagination of these blood vessels, and that stimulates more neurons. And the more neurons you're getting, the greater the connectivity you are getting. And that connectivity ultimately is having the different parts of the brain communicating with one another, and those different parts of the brain communicating with your muscles is leading to cognition, right? Because when we're thinking, that is neurons communicating with one another, right? And so the research is showing that in that prefrontal cortex, this also will stimulate brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a growth factor that stimulates more structural growth in the brain. What we refer to that as you're sprouting these neurons. And then researchers started also studying how this growth factors became present in the hippocampus part of the brain, which is really important for memory. So physiologically, there's a lot happening. And your executive functions is really your CEO of the brain, right? It's your control center. So it's counterintuitive, but when you move more, that helps to stimulate that part of the brain that helps you focus. So one of the biggest reasons teachers leave education, is behavior management. And so if you think about, wow, physical activity can stimulate that part of the brain that helps my kids focus, maybe I should be considering that as well. Maybe even that's more important than the actually academic achievement, because if you focus more, you're going to get that academic performance, right? And so that also helped to, I think, shape where people were thinking about, hey, maybe this movement idea that a lot of people are talking about, especially in adults, it can really help kids as well.
So this is fascinating to me. I mean, the science to me, when you describe it like that, seems to me unequivocal, right?
Right.
That
it's pretty widely accepted now.
Right. And then, as we were mentioning, just makes sense with our, biological history. So how did you go from, getting this knowledge and this understanding, and it seems like there was also a very personal piece, like you recognize yourself in these kids, and I was one of those too. My grandmother used to tell me that she'd tie me down to the chair so I can do my studying, and by the way, this was in my 20s university.
Well, and boys are different than girls,
Right.
They tend to be moving much more in childhood, not necessarily at 20, but definitely when you're younger.
Well, and this speaks to also the work that Richard Reeves does when he's talking about how schools are mainly poorly designed for boys in particular.
Oh,
and
100%.
I think the movement piece, you would agree, is a big part of that. So before you founded Walkabouts, you mentioned you're doing some professional development for teachers. What did that look like?
Yeah. So what I did is I really developed a marketing plan for myself. And I would go to schools and school districts, and I would tell them, obviously, a little bit about the science, but then I would show them how they could teach what they're already teaching. And on the spot right there, we would develop lessons for what they were teaching with physical activity. It was beyond just going to a class, because all of these teachers, Canada might be a little bit different, but in the U.S., elementary teachers have to take a whole host of courses to get certified, which I know they do in Canada too. But one of those courses they often take is like an intro to PE course. And that doesn't really prepare them very well. But some of their other courses, they're learning about human development, right? They're learning about brain development. They understand the importance of what Piaget talked about and movement, giving subtle cues about cognitive development of those children. So it's not like it's completely foreign to them. What I don't think we have done a very good job is the practical application of it. So what I was focusing on was not, hey, here's some big words, here's some real big science. Because when you leave professional development, at least in my experience, the worst PD is I don't have an actionable item, right? My goal was to, okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of the background just to refresh you. But here's something actionable. Tell me what you're teaching right now. Okay. Let's put on a lesson. Let's develop a lesson. You're doing long and short vowel sounds. Let's get the kids reaching up for a long vowel sound. Let's get them squatting down for a short vowel sound. Real simple stuff, right? You can just put it on the board, and right away you get if kids are getting the concepts or not. They're obviously moving. If you've ever done any up and down type of physical activity, that's gross motor movement, using a lot of blood going to those muscles. And so that's really how I began doing it. It was just saying, hey, tell me what you're teaching and let me show you how to do it with physical activity. We were not trying to replace,
curriculum
documented effective teaching practices. It's not like you can do everything with movement. We were saying, have you thought about this? Is a different pedagogy to help you to get your kids to enjoy perhaps learning more, but also to get them to focus. And, many teachers say, oh, that's going to make them more hyper. Not really, actually. If you do it in a very structured way, you set up the guidelines. Hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do some movement. The novelty wears off with them early of just giggling and not taking it seriously. And then they eventually go, hey, this is actually pretty cool because they're able to put it into context. So when you go back to that long and short vowel sound example, long, oh, I reached up, right? You can put that into a context. So much of learning is what is the context that I can retrieve that information. And so when we do math lessons, you have 2 + 2. Well, what is two? 2 jumps, 2 hops, 2 skips. Something that you can then put into context that enables you to retrieve that information when someone is asking you to do so.
I love it. So now if I can ask you to turn to the founding of Walkabouts, what I found like the best ed tech companies are the ones where the founder has a deep knowledge or specialization, and then the desire to kind of like you described, move beyond just what you're physically capable of in teaching. So how did you think about and structure Walkabouts? Maybe just start by talking to us about Walkabouts and what you're doing there.
Yeah, and so I mentioned I met my co-founder at the pool. I I saw the impact that the in-services were doing and the professional development, and I really did think I could reach more people beyond that if I created a technology product that could be available to everyone versus a school or a district that would bring me in to teach PD. I mean, the scale of that is really hard. Whereas, if you have an application that can be used widely via the internet and our platform is all on the cloud, then I think you could have a lot more impact. And that was ultimately what I was trying to do, is have a greater impact beyond just me hopping in my car or hopping on a plane, going to a district or two, and then coming back. So as I was thinking about this, and then I mentioned my co-founder, fortunately, he had a decent background in technology. Because although I had the knowledge, right, the institutional knowledge of what I want it to look like, what is the science behind that? We have a white paper on our website. It's the science behind Walkabouts. I didn't know how to deliver that. I mean, I just didn't know how to deliver that. And so a big part of me partnering with him beyond his marketing expertise is he also understood, at least at a level way more developed than me, on the technology and what we would be looking for when we hire a development team or a developer. So that was really key. Part of that also, though, was, as I'm sure you talk to other entrepreneurs, is this is going to cost money, right? So how do you do that? Initially it's us two putting in money, and then as you realize we need a little bit more help than that. Fortunately, my wife's brother was in the investment space, specifically, private equity, venture capital. And so I reached out to him and said, hey, is this something you're interested in? And he happened to be serving on a school board where his kid go, where kinesthetic learning was really important. It was a private school. So it really matched up well. So we had the three of us with all of our different expertise say, okay, how do we take what I have in my brain and what's on paper, because I had the book, I had these lessons, and how do we make it so we can show people what it would look like so they'd be willing to invest in us? Because ultimately, I can talk about these things, but a potential investor is going to say, show me your prototype, right? Show me your MVP, which is your minimal viable product, right? And so we started going to our family, right? And our friends, the friends and family round. And, how do you do that? And fortunately, my brother-in-law was helpful, and he's done this a lot and had the documentation, because even their family, they want to see a little bit more than just, hey, I want to write you a check. Well, do I have any documentation here? So, we started with a kind of, if you will, borrowing money, a convertible note, right? And raising money. And as we got the prototype and we were starting to show it to people, we realized, okay, and it was really well received, but that was just a prototype, pretty much based on founders' money and maybe a few of the friends, that we needed some bigger dollars. So then you start going through your network and trying to find people who might who are really passionate about education and might be interested in this. And that led us to an angel network, which was actually in Greenville at the time, and it's since expanded to multiple states. And being in Greenville was perfect location, right? So it was very easy to go and try to pitch to that group, and they saw promise in this. They did their due diligence. They reached out to educators and things like that, and said, "Yeah, this could be something that teachers would like." And so there is a addressable market, as you know, and so they made an investment in us, and kind of went from there. Now, I'm sure you're going to ask, so I'll just start in before you. It hasn't been smooth sailing, right? It's not. I mean, so those of you who are listening, you're like, "Oh, sounds pretty easy." No, really hard for so many different reasons. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna maybe cue you a bit there. Is there anything you know now that you wish you knew when it started?
Yeah, no, that's a great one, because I brought that up with someone today. How hard it is to sell into education. I mean, education is really, really difficult. And I remember hearing from the chancellor of the New York school system, I forget his name, but this was years ago. And he talked about, well, people say there's no money in education. Actually, you said the opposite. He goes, actually, there's a lot of money in education, but it's just not necessarily going to the right things. But what most people don't understand about education is, you got to have a little history lesson, is education wasn't talked about in our Constitution, right? So we have the 10th Amendment, which basically says if it's not mentioned in the Constitution, it's really up to the states. So in the United States, the states play a major role in what education curriculum is going to be. Yes, they are funded by the federal government, and that money comes funneled through a variety of different channels. And each president has their own initiative and what have you, and you got to meet these outcomes. But states play a huge role. Well, not only that, you get local, right? I mean, education is ultimately local. So forget even states, you get into different districts. And these districts are making decisions what is best for them. And one district might have a priority of something that is very different than another district. And so we learned very quickly that, okay, there is obviously not a one size fits model. We knew that because learning isn't one size fits. And I'm a kinesthetic learner. By no means we were thinking that would be the case, but we really didn't realize how balkanized it was and how challenging it was going to be. Forget just selling it, just to get a meeting with somebody who might be a decision maker. And so I would say to any entrepreneur going into education is, it can be great, and you can see an impact from your work, but by no means is it something that, I invented this and now I'm just going to go sell it and everything's going to be great.
Yeah, what I always tell folks is you can literally have invented the game-changing educational device, for example, and it would still be difficult to go through the process because of all the reasons and then some that you mentioned.
And all the layers, right?
If I could ask you to give a piece of advice to fellow EdTech entrepreneurs, what would it be?
Yeah, the advice I would give is, one is, don't be afraid to make mistakes, because you're going to make many of them. And actually those mistakes are great because you learn from them. So the first is, if you're an entrepreneur, you're going to be a risk taker. So, and anytime we take risks, you're going to make mistakes. And just recognize that you're going to make mistakes. What I always say to my students, mistakes are normal and natural and should happen because you learn through them. You learn through failure. But you shouldn't make that same mistake again. You should learn from that. The other thing I would say is find good people to work with, right? I mean, usually if you're starting a company, unless if it's later in your life where you have more resources, you might not need other people necessarily to help you. But if you're starting early and you don't have a lot of money, a lot of resources, you need to find people that have skill sets you don't have, And that was advice to me. And to get them involved, say, hey, you're going to be part of this. You're going to own part of this. You're going to have skin in the game as well. And that would be my advice. And the third thing is just know, though, it is not easy. But it is rewarding at the same time. Anything in life that is going to be rewarding is going to be challenging. And just understand, being an entrepreneur and starting anything, whether it's a technology company or starting a foundation or, doing anything in which you are the principal person, it's difficult.
With that, my last question is, if you had a magic wand and you could do anything to the public education system to make it better, what would you do?
Man, that is a great, great question. I could do anything. You know what I'd probably do is I would be much more receptive to community engagement beyond just those who are traditionally trained as educators. And a lot of, I think, problems that happen in education is a lot of the educators think they know how to solve every problem and they have the degrees and the credentials. Whereas a lot of time it's common sense. And if you empowered parents and community leaders to actually come into your school, it's the old neighborhood school model. Like, you got to get back to some of that, where it's not just, okay, we have a lot of elementary schools and then we get fewer middle schools and then even fewer high schools. And then the numbers obviously exponentially increase on the size of the schools. And then it becomes very homogenized and it's like a factory. And versus taking input from people who might never have been in a classroom, but just understand people and understand children. Some states and districts do some of that. And, in South Carolina, we do have a school leadership committees in which people from the community have to serve on them. And so it's not just the echo chamber. It is people from the outside, but we need a bit more of that. And the other part is education needs to be more entrepreneurial. You need to be able to say, hey, this isn't working, because clearly in the United States, our literacy rates are not very good. I think we score like 13th to 15th in our science and math, the TIMSS test. So we're not doing as well as we could, especially because we spend more money than most industrial countries on education, and we're not really necessarily getting the outcomes.
With that, Julian Reed, thank you for your time and sharing your insights to both Edtech founders and superintendents alike.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Buccheri. Until next time.